Okay, thank you for staying in this very hot room. When in my little pitch becoming president of the society, I said I was happy to serve the society in any capacity. I wasn't expecting to be summoned to fill in for my former student, Pablo Bukowski, at very short notice. Pablo has a family emergency, and Pablo is a real communications scholar, so if you're looking for that, I should stress I'm a strict amateur in this area. And Judy's already mentioned this fabulous article that Pablo and his co-author wrote for the handbook. So how do we get to Goffman? I've recently been doing a study of a Web 2.0 site. It's a music site called acidplanet.com. It's owned by Sony. It's a site where people post music, review music, you get a chart placement for your piece of music. It's for amateur musicians. You won't find Madonna on this site. I've been working mainly by interviewing users. We've interviewed about 40 users, including some in South Korea. And I got to the point of the project to start to think, how am I going to approach this theoretically? And I thought that the social construction of technology, an approach that Viva Baker and myself have been associated with, which dovetails nicely with the social shaping of technology approach, very similar approach, actually wasn't very strong on this. Because the thing about the use of this website is it's a part of typical Web 2.0. It's a very mundane use of the website. And this is an environment where the technology is kind of almost like infrastructure. Lee Starr was a pioneer in looking at infrastructure. And this is really infrastructure in a meaning-dense environment. That's how I look at the use of these sorts of websites. And if we're looking at meaning, we'll be looking at social interaction. So I started to think, well, if we think about interacting with this website as a process of social interaction, who do we turn to? Well, Erving Goffman is kind of the pioneer in the field of the sociology of interaction. Of course, Manny Shegloff was a student of Erving Goffman. And so I've been reading, going back to Goffman, trying to see how STS might fit with what Goffman had to say. If anyone's really interested in this, I have an essay that's out in Technology and Culture on this stuff. So my general research strategy, and because STS is very strong on materiality and technology, is to try and put materiality and technology back into social interaction, and then study the role more of social interaction, the sort of thing that Goffman would look at in technologically mediated activities. That's my kind of goal, my game plan. So there's Erving Goffman, the late Erving Goffman, and of course we're all familiar with Goffman as the theorist of drama, dramaturgical work. And these are some of his notions he developed: role distance, face work, co-presence, framing, front stage, backstage, presentation of self in his very rich career. The material rereading of Goffman I've got comes from reading a couple of his pieces. An essay he wrote in 1961 in the book Encounters on role distance, an essay I used to teach at York University when I was teaching sociology there back in the 1980s, and the famous Goffman front stage and backstage distinction, which is in his book on presentation of self in everyday life. So let me just talk about the later essay first, the 63 one, the role distance. He shows how actors step out of role. This is at the time the sort of structural functionist notion of role was very predominant, and Goffman was interested to show that people not only would embrace roles, but they could step out of roles. And this was interesting in terms of issues of identity and in managing complex social hierarchies. And one of the examples, a classic example, there's two examples in that essay. One is surgery, which is I won't deal with today, but that's an interesting topic for STS. The other is the merry-go-round. I had this sudden insight reading it, and I thought, well, of course, the merry-go-round, that's the carousel. This is actually a technology. And it was really strange to know. I was teaching this article at York in the 1980s, and developing with Weber the social construction of technology. I hadn't made the link before that Goffman was talking about technology. So he studied merry-go-round and riders at different ages, and he argues that they first learn to embrace the role, and then they start to exhibit role distance. So you've been with your little kid on a merry-go-round, first very hesitant, parents ride with them. They start to embrace the role, they become confident merry-go-round riders, and then they start play acting. And he calls this play acting role distance. Here's the quote from Goffman, he's marvellous at this. This is an example of the observations from the 1950s, how kids do it. Maybe it's the same today, I don't know. He rides no hands, clasps hands with a mounted friend across the aisle, and he's still young enough to show distance by handling the task with a bored, nonchalant competence, a candy bar languidly held in one hand. And he calls that roll distance. The kid is stepping out of the roll. Now, of course, if you think about it, this merry-go-round, the mechanical properties are what enable the kid to exhibit the roll distance. And by the way, the parents also exhibit roll distance. The parents or the siblings watching the kid go around the merry-go-round, you all have this experience. So you may be talking with someone, then when your kid comes into view, you sort of wave and look enthusiastically. The kid vanishes and you go back to come and say, "Oh yeah, good to see you again, what a surprise." I'd also point out the merry-go-round's a fascinating technology. We should do video studies of this today, I think, because you've also got the administrative apparatus for extracting money from the parent and sometimes the kid. And materiality very matters here. Gottman has a nice footnote that he observed older kids, high school kids, riding real horses as opposed to mechanical horses. And they did this slightly, the roll distance, they exhibited roll distance in a slightly different way on the real horses. They mocked what he called the prissy riding of the horsey set, the more upper class people. So you can do this in a different, you can imagine when they're larking around on a mechanical horse, getting off the horse, they're not going to do this on the real horse. The material circumstances really matter for how roll distance is exhibited. And the same for the surgery example as well. And material and technology stage the performance of interaction, material and technology mediate the performance of interaction. So you can think of that example of the parent looking at the kid. It's like a slowed down kind of movie. The kid's coming into frame, going out of frame, coming into frame again. And so the actual interaction has been mediated by the technology. Now we move to a more famous example. This is where Gottman in the Shetland Islands did his PhD work, which led to the book Presentation of Self in Everyday Life. And he has the famous distinction between the parlour part of the hotel, which is, we can think of it in terms of the restaurant, and that's the front stage, and the backstage, the kitchen and scullery, where the food is being prepared. And he makes this distinction between the sorts of ambience and behaviour that's appropriate for the front stage in the restaurant, much more middle-class norms and behaviour, versus the backstage, the kitchen and the scullery, where the crofters who work there. And he just discusses it in terms of, we'll get to a nice quote, mucus projection. Those of you who are wondering what mucus projection is, it's spitting. Mold, he has a beautiful description of how backstage there's mold on the soup, it's scraped off before it's presented, front stage. Things like butter that comes back, half eaten, is flattened out again, goes out again. So the materiality of the stuff really matters here. And Gottman's wonderful. I think I've got one quote here on this. He says, "Crofter clothing and postural patterns also tended to appear in the hotel kitchen. Thus the manager would sometimes follow local custom and leave his cap on. The scullery boys would use the coal bucket for a well-aimed expulsion of mucus, and the women on the staff would rest sitting with their legs up in unladylike positions." So he's got bodily position, gendered bodily position in this analysis as well. This is a part of Gottman's book on regions, and he talks about the materiality of regions, and he makes very nice observations here. He's very interested in radio, and in a radio studio he noticed the glass of the radio studio, which separates the control room from the main part of the studio, that allows vision, but sound can't come through. He contrasts this with the beaver blocks of American offices, where you can't see each other, but you can hear each other. So he's interested in the materiality of sound as well. And of course this front stage, backstage distinction must rest upon materiality, because one of the conditions for having this front stage and backstage is that you're in a screened off region. You can't see what's happening in the backstage. So the architecture of the arrangement is very important. He discusses this all in great detail. He shows how regions are bounded by material structures and how spaces between regions can be contested. And this is a fascinating thing I found rereading Gottman. He points out that the passage between the kitchen with the working class ambience and the restaurant with the middle class norms is a contested area, because the waitresses moving through that doorway, that narrow passage, want the door open, because it's easier carrying huge trays of food if the door is open. And they don't care if people look into the kitchen. The middle-class managers of the restaurant wanted that door closed because they didn't want the guests seeing the mold on the soup and the mucus expulsion. He describes it as being a contested area, and he says that in fact there's a technological solution to this, a kick door which solves this interaction problem. A door, rather like the door Bruno described, with a groom on it, will shut slowly. It has a reinforced thing on. You can kick it open. Whoops. So he actually talks about this. He's talking about a detailed technological solution in terms to an interactional problem. And this is, I think, not been noticed about Gotham 4. I certainly didn't notice it before. I think it's wonderfully evocative for bringing together STS with these sort of interactional type work. And here I probably disagree with Christian about this, because I think that Gottman needs to be put together, because he's very good on this interaction and meaning, with someone like Bruno's work, Bruno Latour's work, because Gottman is talking about class and gender performances, which are really important for this technological solution, which Bruno does not talk about. So I think if you put together some work by Latour with Gottman, you might start to get somewhere in an interesting place. So what follows from this? Materiality and technologies are part of staging, performing, and mediating interaction. And one of the conclusions I drew from this, often people make this distinction, which I think is a mistake in the use of Gottman. Rich Ling, who uses Gottman, makes, I think, this mistake. People talk about somehow that the mobile world or the internet world is a virtual world, somehow different than the world, the kind of physical world, which is where you have much more what the term is co-presence. I'm arguing that, in fact, all interaction is mediated. The merry-go-round interaction is mediated, as I just argued, and Gottman would argue. And the online interaction is not quite the same, of course. It's just a special form of mediated interaction. And that co-presence is performed and mediated in online environments as well. So, just briefly to conclude, I'm going to quickly go through some of the implications of this approach to Gottman for studying online interaction. So the point there again is that offline interactions, you should avoid this dichotomy between kind of a real world and a virtual world. The sort of sociology I'm after here would try and use the same sort of theoretical framework for both domains. Both worlds, the material worlds, involve mediation and staging of social interaction. Gottman defines co-presence as being accessible, available, and subject to one another. I think that can easily be extended to mediated interaction online. You can think of interactants in letter writing. No one writes any proper letters. The only letters you get these days are bills or advertisements. But if actually in the old, I still have this correspondence with a few of my friends. With my mother, I would write these long letters. It's a whole ritual to letter writing. You're accessible. There's a certain time period when you should reply. Email's the same. When you get an email, you respond in a different way to a phone call. So there are these norms built around how you are accessible and available for these different forms of interaction. And that seems to me rather obvious. How do we think about online interaction? In my own work, I'm thinking about one of the interesting things about these websites is you can only have one person there at a time, but you've still got interaction. And the reason that is so is that you leave a trace, say a piece of music file, or your profile is there, and other people can look at it at a different time, a different space, and interact with it. So an online gathering is still a gathering, even if only one person is at the website. And actually, in terms of sociology of interaction, these online environments are much more interesting because any normative aspects are going to be reinforced because potentially you have very many overhearers and overseers there, a huge number, who can visit your traces. So online co-presence displaced in space and time involved interacting with traces, maybe only one person present, constrained by reciprocation norms, peer norms, and obligations. These are all the sorts of things I've been looking at in my own research. Online interactions, potentially many overlookers and overhearers reinforcing norms and obligation. Online interaction can be treated also as a performance mediated and staged by technology. So just in conclusion, this is a new approach, I think, to material performativity based upon Gottman. So it's different from people like Karen Barad and other approaches to performativity, the Michel Caron approach, the Andy Pickering-Mangle approach. It studies how technologies and materiality enable interactions to be performed. In offline environment, it's the stress would be upon materiality and ordinary interaction, and in online environments, new focus upon how technologies and materiality and changes in them enable properties of social interaction, such as norms and obligations, to become manifest and reinforced. And that's where we'll leave it. Thank you.
very much. We have got a few minutes for some comments and questions, and I think you'll have a sense with me that it's actually been a very interesting kind of interchange, and that it would appear that with a little bit of mixing of this and that, on the whole, people seem to think that we will be able to deal with whatever happens with information and communication technology. But can I open it up to the floor for any comments and questions that there may be? Sorry, we're just getting another mic, so you're going to take that one.
Say some more provocative things.
There's a hand. Great.
Okay, I'll kick things off. Maybe might start a bit of discussion. A little bit of a background. As a youth, typically in Australia, there was a term called mass media maketh the man that we used to have to write a composition on. And I was just interested because I know, you Young, your model of mass and micro and that particular kind of hierarchy model, and the internet sitting to the side as some sort of relation and asking the question there, what is the relation? I note some similarities, by the way, with the theories, the medium system dependency theory and communication infrastructure theory to institutions theory or ecological theory and organisational studies, and I like to call that births, deaths and marriages. So the point I make with media, I think we have kind of these births, deaths and marriages take place at the moment. I make the point again back to Australia, where we have the internet now featuring on television. For example, there are reports given what's been high on the Google list this week, and that's the report. What's the most viewed YouTube video this week, and this is being portrayed on the television. Even to news events, relying on people with a mobile phone to film the news event and showing that footage on the television. I was also amused here in Japan. I can't really understand the language on the television, but I did notice they seem to be reading the newspaper on the television, on the new digital television for me. And I'm also amazed by telephone ring. I'm trying to tie it into most of the speakers. I'm also amused by our telephone ring, where we replace our electromechanical bell with an electronic bell to mimic an electromechanical bell. So what I'm getting at is, rather than the hierarchy of relations and with the model, I'm wondering if there's a need to reconceptualise communications in the sense of, I'm wondering if the term should now be dense media dumbeth the man, and specifically the question is, given this density of media, what are the implications to the social? Thank you.
Sorry, everyone's being very reticent here. So I'll have a go. I mean, I must say, just to be provocative, I'm just going to disagree with Trevor here for a moment about kind of what's new and isn't new. And I'm a great fan of Goffman, and I think you can use Goffman for a lot of things. And I can see that you can sort of rethink a lot of the old studies in terms of the stress of materiality and technology. But my sense is that there are kind of new practices and new habits and new relations, and that a lot of it is reconfiguring and a combination of old and new. But I'm very interested in time and the effect of technologies on time. And so I've actually borrowed from Christian quite often his notion of kind of co-presence, and that having a series of different technologies, some of these new and some of these old, going on at the same time, is actually changing the way in which we kind of have a presence with other people and how we experience our time with people. I mean, I don't think it is the case. I mean, you know, that you can, that nothing new has changed between doing, you know, face-to-face co-presence and it being mediated by a lot of different technologies. And I mean, I know it's the case that people used to use multiple, some technologies at the same time before a bid. I mean, I suppose you could say driving and listening to the radio, or, you know, it's not a kind of complete break, but it seems to me that some of the kind of multiplicity and kind of co-presence we're getting may well be changing how we relate to each other and how we think about kind of time and the kind of density of our networks, actually. And in the work I've done on mobile phones in Australia, people were very, very kind of appreciative. They said to me it was very, very important for them to be able to kind of connect with the important people with them in a kind of co-presence kind of way, to kind of be in touch, to be connected. Anyway, that's just a provocation.
Respond to this, can I? Hey, I've got to respond to this because I wasn't saying nothing wasn't changing. I was saying that mediation, material mediation, is there in offline interaction as well. And a good example where you can apply Gottman, where something new is happening, is I think it's Donna Boyd's work on the early social networking is Friendster, I think was the website she looked at, where you could only, at this time of the website, you could only list 8 people as being your friends. You had this problem of delisting a friend. And this is a new sort of social interactional problem that little kids are used to. I'm not going to, you know, you won't be my friend anymore unless I go to your birthday party or something like that. They delist friends, but most adults don't formally delist. You're no longer my friend, Judy. That doesn't usually happen. So on these websites, the materialities afforded, if you want to use that language, a new type of interactional problem to develop. But she shows that using Gottman is still a way of dealing with this new sort of problem. So I'm not saying there are not new things happening. New stuff is happening, but I think that Gottman is still useful, and that mediation, material mediation, isn't the key thing that's different about these online environments. That's my position.
All right. Would anyone else like a comment before we take another question? No? No? Yes.
So related to what you said, I saw that the Oxford Dictionary is the new word of the year is actually unfriend. So actually, I guess a lot of people are doing unfriend other people.
Oh, that's really interesting, actually.
Well, we should try it.
I'll begin with saying that one way of looking at this panel is that we had 3 faces of STS. We had the social shape of technology, symbolic interactionism, and actor network theory. One thing I've liked about the book, The Social Shaping of Technology, which I've assigned for many years, is that it brought social structure into STS. It had a feminist perspective and it looked at issues of inequality. And that came out in Professor Jung's talk. So my question is, as we look at the relationship between STS and communication or other fields, there's more than one STS. And, you know, Judy, I guess this is more a question to you. Does it matter which STS is in relation to communication? And what's at stake and which side of STS becomes part of that relationship?
I mean, it's a difficult question and an easy question, because I must say that, and this is going to be an incredibly unpopular thing to say, you know, I often think that we kind of spend too much time kind of fetishizing the differences rather than kind of concentrating on the core things we have in common. And I think in a lot of the plenaries I've been in, and I was quite struck in Sheila's talk yesterday, it was very much talking about, well, let's much more focus on what we have in common. And that's why I ended, I think, with the kind of Zitron book, because it seems to me that one of the things, you know, all of us are looking at is the relationship between design and use. We're all interested in that issue. We're all interested in materiality. And it seems to me that that's what we can kind of bring to communication studies, whichever version we're bringing of it. It seems to me that communication studies are looking to us to rethink the socio-technical, the socio-material, you know, meaning and materiality, however you want to kind of put those distinctions. And I think there are kind of rich pickings to be had from whatever version of kind of STS we use to kind of address those problems. And I sort of want to be there a bit more, because I am a bit distressed when I read books like Zittra's that we're not sort of there, you know, and that we should be. So I hope that's an answer.
I think it's a good question, and I stress one aspect of Gottman's work today. Gottman, in his presidential address to the AS